All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into Never Split the Difference.
Oh, yeah, Chris Voss's book?
Yeah, that negotiation book everybody keeps bringing up.
Yeah.
And, you sent us a bunch of reviews and summaries, so it seems like you're really trying to figure out, like, is it hype or is it worth the time?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you right off the bat, it's valuable, but with a big it depends.
Okay.
Valuable for most people, but it really depends on what you're looking for.
Gotcha.
It's not your typical, like, feel-good self-help book. It gets into tactical communication almost to the point where some reviewers are calling it psychological manipulation.
Okay, so not exactly a light read then.
No, not really. It's practical advice,
Right.
especially if you're in a professional setting, negotiating deals, contracts, anything like that. And it's fascinating if you're into psychology and how that plays into strategy.
Okay.
Voss weaves in these crazy stories from his FBI hostage negotiation days.
Right.
And he ties those back to everyday situations.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of the reviews you sent focused on dealing with difficult people.
Exactly.
Like bosses, coworkers, maybe even family.
It seems like you're interested in that aspect too.
Yeah, definitely.
So think of this deep dive as a quick way to figure out if this book will give you the tools you need for those tricky situations.
Okay.
Now, how familiar are you with classic negotiation books like Getting to Yes?
I know it's supposed to be like the negotiation Bible, but I haven't actually read it.
Well, it's very theoretical. Never Split the Difference. It's much more hands-on. For example, Getting to Yes talks about finding common ground,
Right.
which is important, but Voss goes further. He gives you this tactic called mirroring,
Okay.
where you repeat the last few words someone says to show you're listening and to encourage them to elaborate. It's subtle, but it can completely change the dynamic.
Okay, so it's about more than just finding those, like, win-win solutions.
Right. It's about understanding the other person's emotions
Mm-hmm.
and using that understanding to your advantage.
Okay.
Another book that came up in your research was The 48 Laws of Power.
Right.
Both are about gaining an edge, but Voss isn't advocating for ruthless domination.
Okay.
He's more about finding solutions where the both sides feel like they've won,
Okay.
even if one side gets slightly more
Got it. So strategic, but not cutthroat.
right.
Now, what about the actual writing style?
Mhm.
Because some of those reviews mentioned it was a bit repetitive.
Yeah, that's because Voss relies heavily on anecdotes to illustrate his points. On the one hand, it makes it a page-turner, almost like a thriller.
Okay.
But some people find it lacking academic rigor because he doesn't really cite research or provide statistics.
Right.
He's basically saying, take my word for it, this stuff works because I used it to get hostage takers to surrender.
Yeah.
Which honestly is pretty convincing in its own way.
It does kind of make you wonder, like, well, if it works in those situations, maybe it can help with,
Right.
every dull annoyance.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, while the storytelling is engaging,
Yeah.
sometimes it does feel like he's telling the same story multiple times, just with different details.
So if I'm someone who wants just the meat of the information quickly, I might get a little impatient.
Possibly, but don't worry, that's why we're here. We're going to break down the most valuable takeaways in a way that respects your time.
All right, perfect. Let's get to it.
Let's get to the heart of it then. Voss has these core principles that he just hammers home throughout the book.
Okay, let's unpack those. I'm ready for my negotiation toolkit.
Well, the first one is tactical empathy.
Okay.
And this isn't just about being nice. It's about truly understanding the other person's perspective. Even if you don't agree with them, you use that understanding to guide your strategy.
Gotcha.
For example, in the book, Voss talks about negotiating with a bank robber
Oh, wow.
who's holding hostages.
Okay.
Instead of immediately trying to assert authority, he focuses on figuring out what's driving the robber's actions.
Right.
Is he desperate? Is he afraid? Once he understands those underlying emotions, he can start to build a rapport and find a peaceful resolution.
Wow, that's intense. I can see how that would be crucial in like a life or death situation.
Yeah.
But how does that translate to, say, like dealing with a fickle coworker or negotiating a salary increase?
It's about shifting your focus from winning
Okay.
to understanding. Let's say your coworker constantly takes credit for your ideas.
Yeah.
Instead of getting angry, try to figure out why they're doing it.
Okay.
Are they insecure? Are they trying to impress the boss? Once you understand their motivation, you can address the issue more effectively.
Okay, so instead of like going to HR or something, I'd use tactical empathy to figure out what's making my coworker act that way.
Right.
It seems a bit roundabout, but I can see how it might lead to a better solution, long term.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another key principle is labeling emotions.
Okay.
This is a technique to diffuse tension by acknowledging how someone is feeling. So instead of arguing back, you simply say something like, "It seems like you're feeling frustrated."
Hold on. Wouldn't that just make them more defensive? Like,
Uh,
yeah, no, duh, I'm frustrated.
it's counterintuitive, but it actually works.
Really?
By acknowledging their emotions, you validate them, and that can take the wind out of their sails. It shows you're listening and that you care about their perspective.
I guess it's like you're taking the power away from that emotion by naming it.
Right.
Interesting. Okay, what else?
Then you've got calibrated questions.
Okay.
These are open-ended questions designed to get the other person talking and revealing information.
Gotcha.
And so instead of asking, can you finish this project by Friday,
Right.
you might ask, how do you see us getting this project completed by Friday?
Okay,
The first question puts them on the defensive,
right.
while the second encourages them to think through the process and potentially identify obstacles.
Ah, so it's about getting them to articulate their own limitation.
Precisely. And it also makes them feel more involved in the solution. Now, this next one might seem counterintuitive,
Okay.
but Voss is a big believer in the power of no.
Really?
He argues that embracing no can actually move a negotiation forward.
Wait, I always thought saying no was like a negotiation killer.
It can be if you use it aggressively,
Right.
but Voss is talking about using no strategically.
Okay.
For example, if your boss asks you to take on a new project that you really don't have time for,
Mm-hmm.
instead of saying yes, but,
Oh, yeah.
which is kind of a passive-aggressive way of saying no,
Right, right.
try saying something like, I appreciate you thinking of me for this, but I'm not sure how I can fit it into my current workload. Could you help me understand the priorities?
Okay, so it's not about being a pushover. It's about forcing a more honest conversation
Right.
about expectations and limitations. This is starting to make sense.
Good.
But I gotta admit, some of these tactics sound a little manipulative.
That's a valid concern, and honestly, some of the reviewers felt the same way.
Yeah.
Some even accused Voss of being a bit too focused on winning at all costs.
Right? Because there's a difference between being a skilled negotiator and just being a jerk, right?
Exactly.
Like, I don't want to use these tactics to take advantage of people.
And you shouldn't, and Voss wouldn't advocate for that either.
Okay?
It's important to remember that the book is a toolkit, not a script. You have to adapt the principles to your own context and use them ethically. And you have to be self-aware enough to know when a particular tactic might be inappropriate.
So it's about being strategic and thoughtful, not just blindly applying these techniques to every situation.
Exactly. You have to read the room, so to speak.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've talked about like the core principles, but what about those criticisms we touched on earlier?
Right.
Like some reviewers said, the book is just a bunch of anecdotes with no real data to back it up.
Right, and that's a fair point.
Hmm.
Voss doesn't cite much research or offer statistical evidence to support his claims. He's relying on his own experience and anecdotal evidence. But you have to remember, this is a guy who spent years negotiating with hostage takers and terrorists.
Right.
His track record speaks for itself.
Yeah.
And if these tactics work in those high-stakes situations, it's reasonable to assume they can be adapted for less intense scenarios.
Okay, so it's like he's saying, trust me, I've been there, this stuff works.
Right.
And I gotta say, that's a pretty compelling argument.
It is, but
Okay.
ultimately it's up to each reader to decide whether they find Voss's anecdotal approach convincing
Right.
or whether they need more scientific evidence to be persuaded.
That's fair. But I have to say, I'm starting to see the appeal of this book, even with those caveats.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like it offers some really valuable insights into human psychology
Absolutely.
and how to communicate more effectively, even if you're not in a formal negotiation.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so relevant to a wide audience. Even if
Yeah.
you're not a CEO or a hostage negotiator, you're constantly negotiating in your daily life.
That's true.
You're negotiating with your partner, your kids, your friends, your colleagues.
Yeah, so these principles can apply to even like small everyday conversations.
Absolutely. Voss talks about the importance of building rapport, actively listening, paying attention to nonverbal cues. Those are valuable skills no matter what you're doing.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the good, the bad, the target audience.
Right.
If someone's still on the fence about reading Knit or Split the Difference,
Mm-hmm.
who do you think should just like skip it?
If you're someone who wants like a purely academic, research-heavy approach, this book might leave you wanting more.
Okay.
It's very much based on Voss's real-world experiences and the anecdotes that he shares.
So not for the folks who need a ton of footnotes and citations?
Right, exactly.
Okay, got it. Anyone?
Also, if you're like super conflict averse or uncomfortable with pushing back, even gently, this book might not be the best fit.
Okay.
Voss's tactics involve getting comfortable with some level of discomfort, probing for weaknesses, and being assertive.
Right.
It's not about being aggressive, but it does require a willingness to engage.
That makes sense. So wrapping this all up, it sounds like Never Split the Difference is a good read for people who want practical advice on negotiation.
Yeah.
They enjoy like a fast-paced, story-driven style,
Mm-hmm.
and they're willing to put in the work to adapt the principles to their own lives.
I'd agree with that. It's not a magic formula,
Right.
but it's a valuable set of tools that can help you handle those difficult conversations and potentially get better outcomes in all sorts of situations.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for breaking it all down for us.
Of course, happy to be here.
I feel like I have a much better clasp on what this book is all about
Good.
and whether it's right for me.
Yeah.
And what about you, listener? Does Never Split the Difference sound like something you'd add to your reading list? It really makes you think, could this approach be useful in your own life, even outside of formal negotiation? Something to ponder. Until next time, happy negotiating.